All right, welcome in. We're diving into some pretty thought-provoking stuff today. You're here because you, like us, really want to grasp those complex ideas, without drowning in a sea of details.
Exactly.
And today, well, we're tackling a concept that's been a real head-scratcher for thinkers for, well, centuries, really. Fideism. Now, I know for someone like you, someone who values knowledge, real rigorous knowledge and deep philosophical inquiry, this whole notion that faith could stand apart from reason, maybe even clash with it, it's got to be a spark for that intellectual curiosity of yours.
Absolutely. It's a question that cuts right to the heart of how we understand the world and our place in it. And the sources we've got, well, they take us on this incredible journey through different perspectives on this relationship between faith and reason. We're talking big thinkers across different periods, different traditions, all grappling with this fascinating idea.
Yeah, we've got viewpoints that, well, they stretch all the way from like the early days of Christianity right up to present day philosophical discussions. And speaking of terms, I know fideism might sound a bit, well, academic,
A
right?
little bit.
So let's break it down. It comes from the Latin fades, meaning faith. So literally it's faithism, right? But here's the thing. It's not just about, having religious beliefs. It's a very specific philosophical stance on, well, on how faith and reason connect, especially when we're searching for truth.
Think of it like we're mapping out how we come to know things. And faith and reason are, well, they're staking their claims on that map.
Exactly. And our mission today, well, it's to explore that map with you, to really unpack these core ideas of fideism, introduce you to some of the key figures, some of whom have been kind of controversially linked to it, and then to really think about what this all means, what are the implications, and we want to do this, well, without overwhelming you, of course. Keep it clear, keep it insightful.
Yeah, that's the goal. Clarity over complexity.
Okay. So, let's dive right in. What is fideism exactly? Thankfully, our sources, well, they give us a solid starting point. Alvin Plantinga, he defines it as, and I'm quoting here, exclusive or basic reliance upon faith alone, accompanied by a consequent disparagement of reason in the pursuit of philosophical or religious truth.
Yeah, Plantinga really nails those key
He
elements.
does.
He emphasizes that reliance on faith alone, and then, well, there's this downplaying of reason's role,
Yeah.
right? And then it's all about that end goal, reaching truth, whether it's, philosophical truth about reality itself or religious truth about, God, spirituality, that sort of thing.
So it's not simply, having faith. It's about putting faith first, above reason when we grapple with those really big questions. And this is important. Plantinga points out that fideism, it might sound a bit like skepticism at first. That idea that we can't really know anything for sure.
Right, I can see that.
But fideism is actually different. It's more, well, assertive. It claims that we can attain knowledge, but the path to it, it's through faith, not through, just rational investigation.
That's a crucial difference. It's like where a skeptic might say, well, we just can't be certain. The fideist kind of steps beyond that need for rational certainty and says faith is the surest way.
It is. It is. But our sources also make it clear that, how we understand fideism, how plausible it seems, well, it really hinges on how we define these two big words, faith and reason.
Yeah.
Their meanings, they're not fixed. They've shifted and been interpreted in so many ways throughout history.
That's so true. And speaking of history, I think it's fascinating to think about when fideism as a term even entered the philosophical scene.
Right. Where'd it come from?
Yeah. So our sources suggest, and this is interesting, it's a relatively new term.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it likely popped up in the late 19th century within theological debates. Specifically, it was referring to a Roman Catholic movement called traditionalism. This movement, well, they really stressed tradition, right?
Tradition over what?
Over individual, rational interpretation. They saw tradition as the way divine revelation was passed on. And sometimes it also had these links to, conservative social and political views of the time.
So it started as a way to describe a specific trend within theology.
Yeah, but as often happens, the word, it traveled back in time, right?
It did.
Philosophers started using fideism to categorize earlier thinkers, too.
And that's where it gets tricky.
It does. Because there's no real consensus on which historical figures are, accurately labeled as fideists. So trying to map out this neat, clean history of fideism, it's tough because it means taking sides in these debates about, how to interpret these thinkers.
You're taking a stand.
You are. And our sources suggest that maybe it's more helpful to look at how the term has been used, right?
Rather than trying to force a definitive history.
Yeah, exactly. To see how this label, how it's been applied over time,
Yeah.
and what arguments have been made for and against it.
Okay, I like that. So let's talk about one of the figures most often connected with Fideism, Tertullian.
Ah, Tertullian. His famous question, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
Mm.
It's brilliant because it cuts to the core of this tension, right?
Between.
Between reason, Athens, and faith, Jerusalem.
Hmm.
He lived in the second and third century CE, and he's often held up as this early example of someone leaning towards fideism.
He's an early adopter.
He is. He argued that Christian truth that comes from divine revelation, and to those who are relying just on philosophical reasoning, well, it's going to seem obscure, maybe even foolish.
And then there's that really impactful quote that's often attributed to him, right? About the death and resurrection of Christ.
Right, about believing it because it is absurd, certain because it is impossible.
Now that sounds like a pretty clear rejection of reason, right?
On the surface, absolutely.
Right.
But contemporary scholarship, and our sources point this out, they offer this really crucial correction.
Really? What is it?
Yeah. What Tertullian actually wrote was credible esquia ineptum est, which translates more accurately to something like, it is credible because it is unseemly, or it is believable precisely because it is inappropriate.
Okay, so not absurd, but unseemly or inappropriate. That is a significant difference.
It is.
So it wasn't I believe because it's absurd, meaning it's, illogical, but more about the paradoxical nature of the incarnation.
Right, that idea that God becoming human yet remaining fully divine, it's kind of expected. Maybe even beneath human dignity, if you're looking at it from a purely worldly perspective.
From a worldly perspective. So the more nuanced take is that Tertullian, he was focused on this paradoxical nature of this core Christian belief, and also on critiquing philosophical hubris, that human reason alone could fully grasp these divine mysteries rather than just straight up rejecting reason altogether.
And in fact, Eric Osborne, he concludes that Tertullian was a most improbable fideist.
Wow.
Yeah, really emphasizing that Tertullian never really abandoned the value of reason, of Athens in relation to Jerusalem.
That's really interesting. So it's less about an outright rejection of reason and more about recognizing this fundamental tension that's been there from the early days.
Right, this tension between secular wisdom and religious revelation.
It is, and it highlights how tricky it can be to label historical figures,
To look back and impose our categories on.
Exactly, exactly. Now, fast forward a few centuries, let's jump to the Middle Ages, and there's this concept of skeptical fideism. Now, that sounds almost like an oxymoron.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a fascinating development. So we're talking the 13th, 14th centuries. There's this renewed interest in Aristotle's logic and philosophy.
Big comeback for Aristotle.
Huge comeback. And thinkers like Boëtius of Dacia and Sigurd of Brabant, they're faced with this challenge, right? How do you reconcile this rediscovered system with established Christian doctrine?
Yeah, how do you square that circle?
And their strategy, well, it was essentially to draw a line in the
A
sand
line between.
between revealed truths, the stuff they believe you could only access through faith, and then knowledge claims about the natural world, which, they saw as reason's domain.
So it was like saying, okay, faith handles these truths, reason handles these truths, and they don't have to clash because they're operating in different spheres.
That's it. And as Sheila Delaney points out, the main goal of this skeptical fideism, it wasn't necessarily about protecting faith itself. It was more about, well, making space for philosophy.
Carving out some intellectual breathing room.
Exactly. To loosen those constraints that the church might put on philosophical thinking. Delaney even calls it a declaration of independence for philosophy.
It's a bold move.
It is.
So reason gets some autonomy, but it's still, it's a limited freedom.
Right, because religious doctrine, the ultimate authority of God, that's still top dog.
It's the final word.
It is.
Yeah.
Reason can explore the natural world, but when it comes to matters of faith, it's got about a doctrine.
It's got to know its place. Now, our sources also mention this idea of sin and its impact on our ability to reason. How does that fit into this fideism discussion?
Oh, that's a big one. Especially in Protestant theology, we're talking Tertullian, Augustine, and then later, really big names like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Karl Barth, they all argued that, well, sin, it doesn't just damage us spiritually. It messes with our ability to think straight, too.
So it's not just that reason has limitations, it's like actively been messed with.
Yeah, that's the claim. And this contrasts with the Catholic tradition, which historically put more stock in natural theology, that idea that we can figure out stuff about God and morality through reason. And as we mentioned earlier, they've consistently, condemned fideism. You've got papal encyclicals from Pius X, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, all expressing concerns about how fideism could undermine reason's role in understanding faith.
So we've got this internal debate, within Christianity itself.
Exactly.
Different perspectives on how faith and reason relate. Now let's shift gears a bit. Our sources talk about this kind of ironic twist, the strategic use of skepticism during the Counter-Reformation.
Oh yeah, this is fascinating. So picture this. You've got the Protestant Reformation happening.
Yeah, big upheaval.
Huge. And in response, Catholic thinkers like Erasmus, Montaigne, Charon, Gassendi, they used ancient skeptical arguments to defend Catholicism.
So they were using skepticism, which doubts the possibility of knowledge, to support faith.
Yeah. Their logic was this. Skepticism says we can't really know anything for sure, right?
Right.
So it undermines any intellectual reason for becoming Protestant. So the safest bet, stay Catholic based on faith alone.
So it wasn't necessarily like a burning, passionate faith, right? More like a pragmatic, well, if we can't really know, might as well stick with what we've got.
Yeah. It was like a strategic retreat from reason, in
Yeah.
a way. And Terence Penelum, he calls this conformist fideism, which he contrasts with, that Protestant evangelical fideism, which was all about passion, personal commitment, certainty, even in the face of doubt.
Two very different approaches.
Totally. Now, moving on, we got to talk about Kant, Immanuel Kant. Huge figure.
Absolutely massive.
Hmm.
How did his philosophy, how did it open the door for fideistic perspectives?
So Kant, in his critical philosophy, he argued that God's existence, it's not something you can prove or disprove through pure reason, through theoretical reason.
Okay.
Instead, he says it's a postulate of practical reason.
And by practical reason, he means?
He's mostly talking about our moral experience, the inherent demands of ethics, and he really critiqued those traditional metaphysical proofs for God's existence, the ones offered by earlier philosophers.
So he shifted the ground for belief. It's not about logic anymore. It's about morality.
Right. It's about the necessary assumptions we made to live a moral life. While Kant himself was, a proponent of a rational, moral form of Christianity, his whole system, it kind of placed religious belief outside of what we can definitively know.
He's like, science can't touch this.
Exactly. And he famously said, and I love this quote, "I found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith."
He's making space for faith to operate freely.
He is. And this move, it created a space where faith could exist without needing that strict rational justification. It's like it cleared a separate playing field.
It did, and that's a huge turning point. It really set the stage for so many thinkers we now connect with Fideism. Let's talk Pascal.
Wow.
At least Pascal.
Pascal. Yeah, with his incredibly profound, often very personal pensée.
Deeply personal.
He's essential to any discussion about fideism. He had this intense evangelical piety, and he argued famously that belief in God, you couldn't really defend it through those standard apologetic arguments.
The logical proofs.
Yeah, the proofs. And his reasoning was, well, God's nature, it's too vast, too infinitely incomprehensible for our finite human minds to really grasp.
It's beyond our grasp.
It is. He even expressed this kind of frustration with those who demanded proofs. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, who can blame Christians for not giving reasons for their beliefs? They say it's foolishness, and then you complain they don't prove it.
That's a very Pascal thing to say.
It is. And he drew this sharp line between the God of the philosophers, which was this abstract intellectual concept, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of personal biblical faith.
Two very different conceptions.
Absolutely. But his most famous contribution, the one everyone talks about, it's the wager.
Ah, Pascal's wager. For those who haven't heard of it, what's the basic idea?
All right, so Pascal says, reason alone, it can't prove or disprove God, right?
Right.
But we all have to choose, believe or not. And even not deciding, well, that's practically choosing not to believe. So we've got to pick a side.
No sitting on the fence.
Nope. And he frames this choice like a cost-benefit analysis. with, potentially infinite stakes,
High stakes.
the highest. So if God exists, and we believe, the potential reward is infinite eternal bliss. If God doesn't exist, well, you lose a bit of time, maybe. On the other hand, if God exists and we don't believe, infinite loss. But God doesn't exist and we don't believe, well, you gain a bit of time.
So even if we say the chances of God existing are slim, the potential payoff for believing is just, it's so huge that it makes believing the more rational choice, right? From a purely self-interested perspective.
That's the wager. It's about expected value, not about certainty. But of course, it's been criticized a lot.
Of course it has.
People say it's not very pious, to believe just for the reward.
It's like a cosmic insurance policy.
Right. And then there's the philosophical problem of, can we choose to believe? And if the wager works, why the Christian God? Why not, some other deity?
Right. And wouldn't a truly worthy God see through that kind of calculated belief?
Exactly. But even with all that, there have been attempts to reframe the wager, make it more relevant today. Like Joshua Golding, he focuses on the rationality of living a religious life, even if belief in God isn't the foundation of it.
So it's more about the practice than the intellectual assent.
Yeah, that's the idea. But even these newer versions, they still face challenges. So while Pascal gets labeled a fideist, it's more accurate to say he was wrestling with reason's limits when it comes to these huge questions.
Yeah, he was a brilliant mathematician,
Yeah.
He wasn't someone who dismissed reason lightly.
He was using reason to show its own limitations, which then opens up this space for faith. As he said, reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. And with that, I think it's time to move on to another complex figure, Søren Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard, oh, he's a fascinating one. And tricky, partly because he wrote under all these pseudonyms, makes it hard to really pin down his views.
It does. But Kierkegaard himself, he said those pseudonyms, they were a way to address what he saw as this illusion about what it meant to be a Christian, especially in a society that called itself Christian but maybe wasn't really living it. He thought those big philosophical systems like Hegel's, they were turning faith into, just another hero.
Bringing that personal element.
Totally. And he stressed that subjective experience. It wasn't about what you believe, but how. The passion, the commitment.
So the how is more important than the what.
For Kierkegaard, absolutely. Faith, it's about this intense personal commitment. He called it a qualitative leap.
A leap of faith.
Yeah. And he also argued that objective uncertainty, it's necessary for real faith.
Right.
He said, if I am able to apprehend God objectively, I do not have faith. But because I cannot do this, I must have faith.
Wow. So if we could prove God with certainty, it wouldn't be faith anymore.
That's what he's saying, that risk, that uncertainty. It's crucial to that passionate commitment. Now, this emphasis on subjectivity, it's led to some harsh criticism.
Yeah.
Like Naki called it intellectual Russian roulette.
It does sound a bit like you're just believing blindly.
Right. But Kierkegaard's defenders, they'd say he wasn't advocating for blind faith. He's saying that those who have faith, they understand it from the inside, not as this absurd thing from the outside.
It's an experience.
Exactly. And he didn't think faith and reason were enemies. He saw a role for philosophy, for clarifying faith's commitment. So reason, it can lead you to the edge of understanding. And then faith, well, that's the leap.
The leap into the unknown.
The leap beyond. Now let's shift gears to William James.
William James. His essay, The Will to Believe. Classic.
So James, he directly challenges this strict evidentialism.
Yeah.
This idea that it's wrong to believe anything without enough evidence.
You got to have proof.
You got to have proof. But James says, hold on. What about those situations where the evidence just isn't enough?
Like what?
He introduces this idea of a genuine option, a choice between two beliefs that are both live for you, meaning they're both possible.
Okay.
They're forced, meaning you can't avoid choosing. And they're momentous, meaning the decision matters.
So it's got to be real for you, you can't avoid it, and it has to matter.
That's it. And he says, when we're faced with these kinds of options and reason just can't decide, well, maybe our passional nature can play a role, our hopes, fears, desires.
Our gut feeling.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
He pointed out that, we have these two goals when it comes to believing. Avoid being wrong and believe what's true. And science, he says, it prioritizes avoiding error.
Makes sense for science.
It does. But in other areas of life, like relationships, sometimes we need to believe before we have proof, to trust someone.
To take a leap of faith.
Yeah. And that act of believing, it can actually help make the thing we believe true.
So he's applying this to religious belief.
He is. He says the religious hypothesis, the idea that there's this higher eternal reality and we're better off believing in it, is one of those genuine options. And he argues that skepticism, it can be just as risky as believing in terms of potential loss.
You might miss out on something good.
Exactly. So he's not saying believe anything without evidence. He's saying when the intellectual scales are balanced, and it's a big decision, well, we can choose based on our needs, our aspirations. He carves out this space for faith in those situations.
So reason up to a point and then...
Then faith steps in. Now, how about Wittgenstein?
Wittgenstein, always a fascinating but complex one.
The most complex. And his connection to Fideism, it's really debated.
It is.
So his later philosophy, with its emphasis on meaning is use and language games, it's given rise to what some call Wittgensteinian Fideism.
And what does that mean, exactly?
Well, this interpretation, it sees religion as its own little system of meaning with its own logic, kind of separate from everything else.
Its own little world.
Yeah. And they argue that religious language, religious practices, well, you can only understand them if you're in the game, in that specific language game.
You gotta be a player.
You do.
Huh?
Richard Bell, he uses this analogy of separate speech worlds.
Isolated from each other.
Right. But many Wittgenstein scholars, they push back hard against this fideistic reading.
They disagree.
Yeah. While Wittgenstein, he did talk about the diversity of language use, he also talked about the connections, the overlaps. He famously compared language to an ancient city with different neighborhoods, different paths.
All connected, though.
Yes. And it's important to remember the term Wittgensteinian fideism, it actually got popular before some of Wittgenstein's key writings on religion were even published.
So it was based on an incomplete picture.
Exactly. And even Kai Nielsen, the guy who coined the term, he later said it might be a misrepresentation of Wittgenstein's own views. D.Z. Phillips, a big Wittgenstein scholar, he rejected the fideism label too. He argued that, yeah, Wittgensteinians, they deny certain kinds of connections, certain criticisms, but not all of them.
Okay, so what kinds are they denying?
The ones based on a misunderstanding of religious language, religious belief. Phillips, he emphasized the unity of discourse, how even religious beliefs, they're tied to, well, to the rest of life.
So the fideism label, it might be more about the critic's perspective than Wittgenstein himself.
That's a good point. And it leads to a bigger point. Fideism is rarely a self-applied label. It's usually used as a criticism, like relativism or anti-realism.
It's a way to dismiss a viewpoint.
Often, yeah. And our sources bring up David Hume, the skeptic. They talk about how theological skepticism can lead to unbelief. And they quote Hume, who says, "Our most holy religion is founded on faith, not on reason. And whoever believes it to the exclusion of philosophy will be a fanatic and maybe lead into the grossest absurdities." And then he adds this jab. "Whoever is moved by faith to assent to it, he is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience." He's being pretty sarcastic there.
Oh, yeah. So this idea of fideism as a category, it really emerges alongside secular rationality, where God goes from being the starting point to something that needs to be argued for.
Right. And the meaning of faith itself changes. It goes from this broad sense of trust and commitment to, belief without evidence, which in the age of reason, well, that looks like irrationality.
But those labeled fideists, they probably disagree with that narrow definition of reason, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you also have theological critiques of natural theology, like Karl Barth. He argued that Christians trying to prove God through reason is not just pointless, it's actually wrong.
So from his perspective, it's a lack of faith.
A lack of faith, a reliance on human understanding instead of revelation. And the point those labeled fideists often make is that their objection isn't to reason itself, but to this strict evidentialism. That idea that belief is only rational if there's, hard evidence for it.
So not all reason is bad reason.
Exactly. Now, this leads us to a seemingly contradictory idea. Rational fideism sounds impossible, right?
Yeah.
But there are philosophers today who are trying to reclaim that term.
Rational fideism.
Yeah. C. Stephen Evans, in his book, Faith Beyond Reason, he talks about responsible fideism. He argues that faith steps in where reason reaches its limits. He acknowledges reason's role, but says faith operates beyond reason, not necessarily against it.
Okay. And we also have John Bishop. He proposes something he calls, and I love this, modest, moral, coherentist, supra-evidential fideism in his book, Believing by Faith.
Quite a mouthful.
It is.
But it's interesting. He draws on William James Starts with this idea of evidential ambiguity. The evidence we have, well, it could support theism or atheism, but doesn't definitively prove either. So he argues that it's morally okay, under certain conditions, to have these doxastic faith ventures, basically choosing to live as if God exists, even without that hard proof.
So you're taking a gamble.
Kind of, yeah. But he's careful to say this is super-evidential, meaning it goes beyond the evidence, not counter-evidential, meaning against it. And what's interesting is, Bishop, he focuses on the ethics of belief.
Whether it's morally right to believe?
Right, whereas Evans, he's more concerned with, the knowledge part of it. Bishop even suggests that some form of fideism might be unavoidable for anyone who really thinks about their beliefs, especially given certain epistemologies. And he sees fideism as a response to modern thought, like the dominance of rational empiricism.
Okay. And then there's Duncan Pritchard. He talks about quasi-fideism, but he actually rejects the term fideism because he thinks it unfairly implies that religious beliefs are, well, irrational.
Yeah, he's got a problem with the baggage that term carries.
It does have some baggage.
It does. And he argues that all beliefs, at their core, they rely on these hinge commitments, assumptions we just accept without needing further proof.
Things we take for granted.
Exactly.
Sure.
He gets this from Wittgenstein's later work on certainty. And Wittgenstein, he called these hinge propositions. They're like the unmovable foundation for everything else.
They're bedrock.
They are. And Pritchard's point is that religious belief, it's not unique in relying on these hinges. So we shouldn't single it out as irrational. He says it can still be rational, depending on how those hinges fit within your whole system of beliefs.
So for him, faith, in a very basic sense, it underpins everything we believe, not just religious stuff.
That's his argument. Now, for a contrasting view, we have Quentin Meillassoux.
Yeah.
He criticizes fideism. And he does this by arguing against any limits to reason.
Okay.
He wants to challenge religious theism by saying, look, it doesn't get this special untouchable zone.
So reason can explore anything.
Anything. And he targets what he calls correlationism, this idea coming from Kant that our thinking and being are, well, they're linked. We can never access reality totally independently of our thoughts.
So we're trapped in our own minds, in a way.
Kind of, yeah. And Meillassoux sees this as a dogma. He says it limits reason and opens up this space for what he calls irrational discourses about the absolute, like religion.
So by limiting reason, you're actually making room for irrationality.
That's his argument. And he even says that strong correlationism is merely the other name for fideism. Because when you restrict reason to just what's correlated with thought, well, you're handing over the absolute to religion. And Meillassoux, he tries to reopen access to the great outdoors, to the things in themselves, mostly through math and this idea of ancestrality, which deals with stuff that happened before human consciousness even existed. He rejects any notion of a necessary being, and he proposes this principle of unreason, which basically says contingency is absolute.
So everything is ultimately contingent.
That's his view. Now, he does want to bring the concept of God back into philosophy, but it's a God whose in existence is also contingent. It's a very different conception.